For decades, Judge Wexler handed down harsh, biased sentences, silencing poor and minority defendants behind courtroom walls. That all changed when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronted him face-to-face in a nationally televised hearing, triggering a wave of overturned cases in a historic judicial investigation. But what explosive truth did she reveal that shattered his reputation in just 30 seconds? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the federal courthouse of Columbus, Ohio, tension clung to the walls like moisture before a storm. This wasn't an ordinary hearing. It was a historic and public judicial review, something rarely granted and even more rarely televised. The courtroom, normally a place of rigid decorum and controlled speech, now throbbed with the anticipation of confrontation. Every seat in the gallery was taken: legal scholars, reporters, former defendants, and curious citizens. A discreet line of cameras streamed the proceedings to thousands watching across the country. The name at the center of it all sat high above the chamber: Judge Roland Wexler. Though retired, he now found himself the subject of scrutiny for a string of controversial and punitive rulings that had raised ethical alarms. He wore his robe anyway, as if it could still shield him. Chin slightly raised, fingers folded, he scanned the room like a king forced to entertain the court of public opinion. Across from him, seated at a long, plain wooden table, was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Her presence was no coincidence. She had been summoned by the State Judicial Committee not as a politician, but as a former civil rights attorney, a practitioner who had faced Wexler's rulings in real courtrooms, defending real people crushed by his iron approach. Her reputation preceded her: precise, fearless, and deadly in cross-examination. Dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, she looked like the only person in the room who didn't need the cameras to validate her voice. As the clerk read the case summary, charges of excessive sentencing, disregard for legal precedent, and patterns of judicial bias, the room grew tighter. You could hear the breath in people's chests, but not the exhale. Wexler sat like a monument to the old guard, unbothered, unmoved, but not unshakable. Jasmine didn't look at him. Not yet. She stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, hands still, calm, ready. Behind her eyes was a storm that had waited years to speak. As the room settled and the panel prepared to hear opening remarks, all eyes turned toward the bench, toward the man whose rulings had shaped destinies and sparked today's reckoning. It was time for Roland Wexler to speak. Judge Wexler leaned forward slowly, the worn wood of the bench creaking under his weight like it, too, had grown tired of holding him up. His voice, when it came, was steady, measured, almost theatrical, as if he were delivering a closing argument in the court of history itself. For over 3 decades, he began, I upheld the law without fear, without favor, and without bending to popular whim. His words cut through the silence like cold steel. Order, he said, is not built on empathy. It is forged through discipline, through consequences, through clarity. He scanned the room deliberately, his eyes resting for a fraction of a second on Jasmine Crockett before continuing. Some now say my sentences were harsh, that I lack compassion. But I ask you, what society thrives on leniency? What community is safer when its laws are optional? The question hung in the air like a trap. He straightened his back, his voice rising just slightly, wrapped in authority. I've seen families cry in my courtroom. I've watched juries hesitate, and I've made hard calls, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. He paused there, letting the weight of his own myth linger. We live in a time where discipline is called cruelty, and structure is labeled oppression. I reject that. I did not serve to be liked. I served to protect. Murmurs stirred along the back wall. Jasmine remained stone still, but beneath her composed exterior, the words were landing not as arguments, but as insults, as echoes of a system that had punished not crime, but circumstance. Wexler's gaze drifted back to the panel, his tone calm again, too calm. You don't build justice by listening to feelings. You build it by drawing lines and standing firm when others waver. He folded his hands like a man who believed he had already won. But he hadn't seen the storm about to answer. Jasmine walked to the center of the courtroom with the quiet gravity of someone carrying names, not numbers. She set a thick folder on the table with a dull, deliberate thud, the sound of lives archived in ink and verdicts. The panel leaned in. The gallery stilled. "I won't waste your time with philosophy," she began, her tone clean and razor-sharp. "Let's deal with facts, yours." She opened the folder. Judge Roland Wexler presided over 1,448 criminal cases between 1994 and 2020. In that time, 89% of defendants without private counsel received the maximum sentence allowable by law. 89%. Let that sink in. She paused, letting the silence stretch until the number echoed like a drumbeat. Then, without looking up, she flipped to the first file. State versus Everett, a 19-year-old charged with breaking into a pawn shop. No priors, no weapon, no violence. Sentenced to 11 years. Overturned on appeal. The court wrote, and I quote, "The sentence reflects punitive intent rather than proportional justice." She didn't glance at Wexler. Not yet. She wasn't here for theatrics. State versus Moreno, 10 years for simple marijuana possession, no priors, no trafficking, no victims. The defense wasn't allowed to introduce character testimony. That ruling, too, overturned. The appellate court noted a troubling disregard for due process. She moved to a large easel beside her, where a chart stood ready. With one clean gesture, she pulled the cover sheet away. Red spikes on a black and white graph stabbed up like warning signs. "This is your sentencing history, Your Honor. This line right here, this spike in max sentencing, that's the year public defenders' offices lost funding in your district. That same year, max sentences increased by 37%. But let's be real, this wasn't about policy. It was about power. Because when poor people can't fight back, you don't need to justify anything, do you?" Gasps now. Audible ones. Reporters scribbled faster. The courtroom murmured. But Jasmine's voice didn't tremble. It cut deeper. "I'm not here to grandstand," she said. "I'm here because I represented the people you sentenced. I sat beside them as you stared down from that bench, eyes cold, already decided. I remember State vs. Linford. He was 17, charged with auto theft. You called him a repeat failure to society, before the evidence was even presented. The jury found him guilty. You gave him 14 years, no violence, no one harmed, no second chance. But I was there. I heard the way you said you people in that courtroom, and I saw the way his mother collapsed when the bailiff took him away." She turned to face Wexler now, voice low, but steady enough to hold every soul in the room by the throat. "You called it structure. You called it deterrence. But what you built was a courtroom where outcome was decided before trial. You criminalized poverty. You punished youth. And over again, you ignored context to uphold control." Then she held up a yellowed legal pad, its corner frayed, its cover faded. "This is your handwritten docket from State versus Jordan, 2011, underlined twice in your handwriting. Needs to feel fear." She let that sink in. "That's not law, that's ego." Wexler shifted subtly but visibly. His fingers tightened against the bench's edge. His jaw set. Jasmine turned to the panel again. "We pulled transcripts, reviewed sentencing patterns, compared them to district norms. He is an outlier in nearly every measurable category. Sentences longer, bail set higher, appeals more frequent, overturn rates double the national average. And most damning of all, time and again, mitigation was ignored. Not once, not twice, systematically." She tapped the file. "It's all here. Every name, every date, every ruling that turned lives into footnotes." Her voice dropped, slow and precise now. "We tell people to trust the system, to trust the robe. But how do you trust a man who made a career out of calling fear a tool? Of dismissing pleas for mercy as noise?" She looked directly at him now, a stare not of anger, but exposure. "This wasn't law, Judge Wexler. It was control. Dressed in black, passed down with impunity, and protected by silence. Until now." The documents had been laid bare, the names spoken aloud, and for a moment it felt like justice was finally speaking back. But the silence that followed Jasmine's final words wasn't surrender. It was the quiet before retaliation. And Wexler, bruised but not broken, was ready to strike back. Judge Wexler leaned forward, his knuckles whitening against the bench, his voice low but sharp, like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "Congresswoman," he said, stretching the word like an insult, "you've turned this courtroom into a campaign stage." His words were slow, deliberate, laced with disdain. "You throw numbers and headlines as if justice is a popularity contest. But let me remind you, I didn't sit in that chair to win applause. I sat there to make decisions no one else had the courage to make." The room tensed. Every camera angle shifted slightly, like prey adjusting to the predator's movement. You speak with the luxury of hindsight and political comfort, but the bench doesn't come with a pause button. It comes with grief, blood, consequences. His voice rose now, flush in his face, his eyes locked on Jasmine like a hawk sizing up its prey. "You've never had to stare down the family of a murdered child while deciding if a killer deserves mercy," he snapped. "You've never felt the weight of knowing your ruling might free someone who destroys another life tomorrow." His words struck like hammer blows, meant not just to defend, but to shame. What you call bias, I call discernment. What you call cruelty, I call clarity. You stand there with your prepared speeches and cherry-picked statistics, but you have no idea what real justice costs until you've had to measure it in broken mothers and buried sons. His voice cracked just slightly, not with emotion, but with fury barely contained. The courtroom shifted with him. The atmosphere changed, not the careful pace of testimony, but something closer to combat. The panelists stiffened. Reporters stopped scribbling. The gallery, once filled with murmurs, now leaned in breathless. Wexler wasn't rebutting. He was retaliating, swinging not with logic, but legacy. "You think justice is about feelings," he spat, "that if you say something with enough passion, it becomes truth. But passion doesn't make you right. It makes you dangerous." He paused, then leaned in closer, eyes narrowing. "You didn't come here to help people. You came here to carve your name into a man's back and call it justice." Wexler's voice had just filled the room with fire and fury, a last stand cloaked in righteous anger. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't fight rage with rage. She reached for something heavier than opinion. Proof. "Your Honors," Jasmine said, her voice crisp but controlled, "I request to submit audio evidence from State versus Callahan, March 17th, 2012. Her hand didn't shake as she passed the flash drive to the technician. She didn't look at Wexler. Not yet. The panel exchanged glances, then nodded. A soft beep, a hiss of static. Then clarity. Not Jasmine's voice, not narration, but a recording that carried the weight of 1,000 quiet injustices. "The court finds the defendant guilty and sentences him to the maximum allowable term. Let this serve as a message. The public needs examples. This young man will be one." Wexler's voice, deep and measured, echoed through the chamber like judgment from a forgotten god. There was no emotion in it, no context, just a final sentence. Clinical and cold. "The defendant in question, Eli Callahan, age 18, first-time offender, no weapon, no violence, arrested for stealing a used sedan, no damage. The vehicle was recovered, but in that moment, he was reduced to a symbol. A warning shot fired by a judge more interested in setting precedent than seeking truth." When the recording clicked off, the courtroom did not exhale. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that follows a confession or a crash. The kind of silence that says, "We heard it. We cannot unhear it." A court officer in the corner froze, pen halfway through a note. A reporter lowered their recorder slowly, forgetting to hit stop. Jasmine stepped forward, not dramatic, not rushed, just precise, like someone who'd walked through this kind of silence before. Her heels struck the polished tile with soft, deliberate taps. The distance between her and Wexler closed in with every step. She didn't raise her voice. She made them lean in. "That young man had no prior record," she began, eyes locked on the bench. "He was 18. He made a mistake. One that should have cost him 6 months, maybe probation. But you gave him 7 years. Why? Not because he was dangerous, but because he was visible, because he was easy to punish, because he was poor. She opened a thin folder, just one page this time, and held it up. The defense motioned for leniency. They cited his clean history, school attendance, even community service. You denied the motion without explanation. But the reason is right there, in your own words. The public needs examples. Her gaze never left Wexler. So you turned a child into a cautionary tale. You didn't sentence him for what he did. You sentenced him for what you wanted him to represent. Wexler's posture tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench, his eyes narrowing just slightly, like a man remembering something he'd hoped was forgotten. But Jasmine didn't slow. She took another step, voice sharpening. You've claimed your bench was neutral, that your role was to uphold order, but that recording proves something else, that you treated your courtroom like a stage, and that young man like a prop. She paused just before the final blow, not for effect, but because the weight of what she was about to say demanded stillness. One breath, one heartbeat. Then, "Sir, you did not judge by the law." She stepped even closer. "You judged by your bias. You sentenced from fear, from ego, from a place no constitution defends." Her words hit harder than any ruling, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. Behind her, the gallery was frozen. Reporters stared wide-eyed. One jurist on the ethics panel shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to his notes. Wexler didn't respond. For the first time that morning, the man who had spoken with such towering confidence said nothing. And that silence, that exact moment, felt like the first time in years the courtroom belonged not to power, but to truth. The audio had shaken the room, but Jasmine knew that power doesn't fall with logic alone. It falls with the truth no one was supposed to hear. And what she had next wasn't an argument, it was a match. And the courtroom was dry timber. Jasmine turned back to the table, her steps unhurried, like someone walking into the center of gravity. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sealed, time-worn envelope, thin but heavy with something far larger than paper. "I've held on to this for years," she said softly, her voice carrying farther than its volume should allow. "Not because I was afraid to use it, but because I knew the day would come when silence would no longer protect the truth." She paused, holding the envelope in both hands, then raised it so the panel and the cameras could see. "This is a formal letter of appeal filed in 2015 by a senior public defender named Leland Marcus. It was submitted following the sentencing in People v. Harrow, a case that was forgotten by everyone, except the family that lost a son to a courtroom that never gave him a chance." She unfolded the letter slowly, methodically, her fingers steady despite the storm she was about to unleash. "In this letter," she continued, "Mr. Marcus recounts a closed-door meeting that took place in Judge Wexler's chambers just minutes before sentencing. No jury, no transcript, no oversight, just a defense attorney, a prosecutor, and a judge who thought he couldn't be heard." The tension tightened like a fist around the room. Jasmine inhaled once, then read aloud. "They're garbage," you said. "Trash clogging the system. They need to be swept out before they infect the next generation." She didn't add to it. She didn't explain. The words were enough. They detonated in the room like a thunderclap in still air. The sound of shock was not a roar, but a vacuum. Reporters froze mid-sentence. One court clerk's hand dropped from the keyboard. The panelists, until now composed and stoic, sat stunned, one visibly blinking, as if trying to reset what he'd just heard. Even the gallery, victims, advocates, former defendants, seemed to hold their collective breath. Jasmine looked up from the page and locked eyes with Wexler. Those weren't the words of a judge upholding justice. They were the words of a man who saw defendants not as citizens, not even as humans, but as waste. A man who didn't sentence based on law, but on disgust. She took a step forward, the letter still in her hand, held like a weapon too sharp for fiction. "You didn't say it on the record. You didn't have to. You said it where you thought no one would ever dare to repeat it." She turned to the panel, her voice gaining weight without ever rising. This wasn't a moment of frustration. It was a philosophy, a belief system embedded in rulings, sentences, decisions. It was present in every maximum penalty handed to a scared teenage boy. It was alive in every bail set too high for a working mother to afford. It infected this courtroom, and we are here because for too long, no one challenged it. She faced Wexler again. "Your Honor," she said, the words clipped with precision. "Do you deny you said it?" He didn't respond. His face was rigid, eyes wide but unfocused, as if his body were still here, but his mind had fled somewhere unreachable. He blinked slowly, his hands gripping the edge of the bench like he needed it to hold himself up. But the silence was more revealing than any answer, because in that silence everyone understood. He remembered. Jasmine lowered the letter, but didn't look away. "A judge's power doesn't just come from the gavel," she said. "It comes from the illusion that justice and authority are the same thing. But they're not. Not when the man behind the robe believes that some lives are infections to be scrubbed away." The panel didn't move. The air itself had turned heavier. What Jasmine had delivered wasn't a rebuttal. It was an indictment. Not legal, but moral. Not shouted, but carved into the very floor of the courtroom. Wexler didn't argue. He didn't blink. He didn't even breathe. And in that stillness, the image of the untouchable judge cracked. Not with noise, but with truth. And this time, there was no gavel loud enough to cover it. The silence that followed Jasmine's final words didn't stay in the courtroom. It slipped past the marble walls, crawled into the hallway, and sprinted into the streets. By the time the doors opened, the world was already listening. The first post came just 15 minutes after the hearing recessed. Grainy footage from a court observer's phone, no captions, just 38 seconds of Jasmine Crockett standing before the bench, holding up Wexler's own words like a mirror he couldn't look away from. No narration, no commentary, just raw, unedited truth. But truth didn't need a filter. Within 20 minutes, the clip was reposted by a legal blog with the caption, "She didn't just speak, she dismantled him." By the end of the hour, the truths Jasmine Crockett, Wexler exposed were trending simultaneously. Newsrooms scrambled. Anchors scrapped their lead stories. On Twitter, a slowed-down replay of Jasmine reading the phrase, "They're garbage, sweep them out," hit 1.2 million views before lunch. The clip wasn't just viral, it was seismic. People weren't just sharing it, they were quoting it, stitching their own courtroom experiences to it. Law students posted, "We were taught to study his rulings. Now we're studying his downfall." Survivors of his sentencing posted photos, holding signs that read, "Wexler sentenced me. Jasmine spoke for me." In Facebook groups for public defenders, former colleagues began sharing what they'd kept quiet for years. "I was there when he called a defendant's tears performance theater. He told me, I don't rehabilitate. I remove problems." These weren't isolated memories. They were puzzle pieces finally falling into place. Then came the statements. The Ohio Public Defender's Office released a short but damning comment. "Many of our attorneys raised concerns about bias in Judge Wexler's courtroom. Most were ignored. We stand with Congresswoman Crockett in her call for accountability." The American Bar Association issued a follow-up within hours, calling for a comprehensive review of judicial ethics standards across state and federal levels. What had once been whispered in back rooms and law libraries was now center stage, and the public was watching every frame. By 3 p.m., major networks had cut away from scheduled coverage to stream an emergency panel on judicial overreach. One former prosecutor broke down live on camera as she recalled being ordered not to file a complaint about a hearing where Wexler belittled a teenage defendant in open court. "I knew it was wrong," she said, "but I was told that's just how he is." And now that excuse was disintegrating under the heat of exposure. Former clients, men now in their 40s and 50s, came forward in droves. A father from Cincinnati spoke through tears on a live stream. "I spent 10 years away from my daughter because that man thought poor meant dangerous. I never had a voice in his courtroom. Today I do." Then just before sunset came the moment Jasmine had expected, but didn't chase. The official announcement. The Ohio State Judicial Ethics Committee released a formal statement. In light of new and credible evidence suggesting long-term abuse of judicial discretion, The committee will open a full-scale investigation into the conduct and rulings of Judge Roland Wexler, retired. The statement went further than expected. It included a public call for submissions, inviting attorneys, former defendants, and court personnel to come forward anonymously. The phone number and email were shared publicly. Within the first hour, they were overwhelmed. Inside Wexler's office, once a symbol of untouchable authority, phones rang unanswered. Staff were seen leaving the building, their expressions unreadable. He issued no statement, no rebuttal, no denial. For a man who had always controlled the final word, he now had none. Local papers ran full-page headlines the next morning. The gavel breaks. National media dubbed it the Crockett Reckoning. And still, Jasmine didn't speak to the press. While her name flooded the news, she returned to her office, took no victory lap, and issued no statement. But people already knew. She had said what needed to be said, and the echo of that truth was only getting louder. Because in a justice system built to protect itself, it only takes one voice with nothing to lose to start pulling the whole structure into the light. For 3 straight days, the headlines didn't change. Wexler's name was everywhere, on news tickers, podcasts, courthouse steps. But inside those walls of stone and silence, where he'd once ruled, the balance had shifted. For the first time, the system wasn't shielding him. It was watching him, and he knew it. It arrived with no cameras, no podium, and no dramatic farewell. Just a PDF uploaded quietly to a state server at 8:04 a.m. The title, Statement from the Office of Roland C. Wexler. Plain font, black and white. But what it said lit up every newsroom across the country within minutes. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position on the Judicial Ethics Advisory Board. I do so to preserve the integrity of the institution and allow it to continue its work without distraction. It was 39 words long. Not a single one acknowledged the hearing. Not a single word addressed the clip, the quote, the thousands of voices now demanding accountability. And yet, those 39 words marked the final breath of a career that had towered for decades. Wexler didn't appear on television. He didn't walk the courthouse steps. There were no tearful statements, no last-minute interviews. What came instead was silence. The same silence he'd once ruled over from the bench. The kind of silence he had imposed on defendants who'd tried to speak, to explain, to beg. Now it was his silence. Cold, empty, hollow. His office refused comment. Staff wouldn't answer the phone. Colleagues who once boasted about learning under him quietly began archiving their connections. His name, once printed in bold on alumni banners and state ethics brochures, began vanishing from websites overnight. But no amount of vanishing could erase what had already been seen. The clip of Jasmine Crockett standing in that courtroom still circled the internet like wildfire on dry grass. Her voice unwavering, her words surgical. You judge by your bias. And now the man who had once stood above that courtroom, above criticism, above consequence, had folded. Not in rage, not in protest, but in retreat. A retreat carefully packaged in the language of dignity, but transparent to anyone paying attention. This wasn't a graceful exit. This was self-preservation. A man stepping away not to protect the system, but to protect himself from it. Legal analysts immediately dissected the statement. It's a shield, one former appellate judge told CNN, a way to resign before the findings can stain him formally. But the damage had already been done. The court of public record had already written its verdict. On Reddit threads, former defendants posted side-by-side images of their sentencing transcripts in Jasmine's courtroom moment, using hashtags like Wexler did this, injustice delayed. A law school in Chicago announced they were replacing Wexler-authored case studies in their judicial ethics course, calling his rulings ethically compromised by bias patterns now under public review. And still, Jasmine said nothing. When asked for a comment, her press secretary issued just 6 words. Congresswoman Crockett is focused on policy. No victory lap, no press tour. While Wexler disappeared into silence, Jasmine doubled down on her legislative efforts, pushing forward reforms on judicial transparency, case audit systems, and mandatory bias training for all state-appointed judges. She didn't need to gloat, because power doesn't always end with an explosion. Sometimes it ends with a single document, quietly filed, when the truth becomes too loud to ignore. Back in Columbus, the ornate wooden door to Wexler's former committee office stayed shut. No new name was etched into the glass. Just the faint outline of the old one, peeled off, leaving behind a ghost. A man who once believed himself untouchable had stepped away, and the world kept moving, just not in his direction. Not anymore. Wexler's resignation sent ripples through the legal world, but for Jasmine Crockett, it was never about one man's fall. The gavel had dropped, the headlines had shifted, and the spotlight begged for her next move. But she didn't care for lights. She cared for the shadows where stories like hers were rarely told, and justice rarely reached. So she went where no camera followed. 2 days after the resignation, while pundits debated her legacy and news outlets refreshed analytics on her viral moment, Jasmine stepped quietly through the rusted gates of the Eastview Community Reentry Center. No press, no entourage, just her and a legal aide carrying a battered notebook and a bag of handwritten letters from families who had watched the hearing from halfway houses and kitchen tables across the country. The center stood on the edge of town, housed in a converted school building, the paint fading, the grass wild. But inside it pulsed with something raw and necessary. Real lives in recovery, real people trying to rebuild what the system had broken. The director greeted her with cautious warmth. No one there had expected her to show up, not after everything, not after the storm she'd walked through. But Jasmine didn't come for applause. She came because change doesn't end when the camera's cut. She walked into a narrow rec room, its floor scuffed and lined with folding chairs, where a dozen men and women sat in a loose circle, some hunched over, others upright but wary. These weren't constituents in suits or lobbyists in ties. These were the forgotten, the processed, the punished. Some had served 5 years, others 15. Most had never even been asked what their lives had looked like beyond the docket. Jasmine didn't begin with a speech. She just sat down, crossed her legs, and listened. For 20 minutes, no one said a word. Then a man in his 40s with inked knuckles and tired eyes broke the silence. "I did 10 for a third strike," he said, voice low. "Shoplifting. I was high. Didn't even remember walking into the store. Wexler didn't care." Another man nodded, hands folded tight in his lap. "You said what we've been yelling for years," he muttered. "Difference is, you said it where it mattered." Jasmine didn't interrupt. She just nodded, her eyes locked with theirs like she was memorizing every name they wouldn't forget. Then came a voice that broke the room open. A young man, barely in his 20s, stood up, his voice trembling but clear. "I did 3 years for possession," he said. "First offense. No weapon. Just weed in a glove box. Judge Wexler said I needed to learn early." His jaw clenched. "No one listened when I said I wasn't a danger. No one even looked at me." He paused, then looked directly at Jasmine. "But this week, someone spoke loud enough for all of us, and I finally felt heard." Jasmine looked down for a beat, emotion tightening in her chest, but not breaking her. She nodded once. That was all. The rest of the hour passed not in speeches, but stories. Stories about broken families, about prison letters that were never answered, about job interviews ruined before they began. Jasmine never once brought up her victory. She didn't need to. Her presence was louder than any headline. And when she stood to leave, one woman followed her into the hallway, gripping her wrist gently. "I used to think power only lived in courtrooms," the woman whispered. "But you brought it here, into this room, into us." Jasmine didn't respond with words. She just pulled the woman into a hug. No cameras, no sound bites, just the truth, held quietly between two people who understood it too well. That evening, as the world continued to spin her story into talking points and opinion columns, Jasmine returned to her apartment and turned down every interview request waiting in her inbox. Instead, she opened her laptop, connected a simple microphone, and clicked record on a small podcast hosted by a retired legal aid worker. A show with no sponsors, no ads, and barely 1,000 listeners. But it was the one space she trusted to speak plainly. The podcast host, Bernard Tollefson, greeted her like an old friend. "You've got the whole country on fire right now," he said with a warm chuckle. "So tell me, what does it feel like to win?" Jasmine took a breath, long and quiet. "That's the thing, Bernie," she said. "This doesn't feel like a win. Not yet." Her voice was calm, but it held weight, like a dam holding back a flood. "I didn't say what I said in that courtroom because I wanted a headline. I said it because people have been carrying that truth for years, and no one would say it for them." Bernard leaned closer to the mic. "What do you think made people finally listen?" She paused, then answered slowly. "Maybe, because this time, the pain came with proof, and I didn't flinch." Another pause. "But more than that, maybe people are just tired of pretending the system is neutral. It's not, and sometimes the only way to fix it is to name what it really is." Then in the final few seconds of the episode, just before the soft acoustic outro played, Bernard asked, "What would you tell people who feel like they've lost too much to fight?" Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned in, and with a voice barely louder than a whisper, she said, "The truth doesn't need a microphone, doesn't need a robe. It just needs someone brave enough to say it at the right time." And then the recording stopped. No music swelled, no dramatic exit, just silence. But this time it was the kind of silence that follows after something true has finally been said. Not an ending, a beginning. Jasmine's words echoed far beyond the courtroom. They didn't just shatter one man's illusion of justice. They awakened thousands who had long believed their suffering would stay buried. And now what began as a reckoning was turning into something more. A movement built on memory, truth, and the fire of those who had once been silenced. The ripple began quietly. An old court transcript uploaded to a community forum, a dusty case file reopened by a law student who had watched Jasmine's clip on repeat. But within weeks, the quiet turned into a wave. Former defendants, men and women once dismissed, ignored, or forgotten, began stepping forward with names, docket numbers, and memories too specific to fabricate. One by one, they reached out to local legal clinics, to journalists, even to strangers online. They weren't just angry, they were ready, and they all had one thing in common. Their lives had been touched or shattered by Judge Roland Wexler. Among the first to go viral was Samuel Ford, a 67-year-old former janitor from Dayton. His story had gathered dust for over 2 decades, filed, archived, and forgotten. In 1999, Wexler had sentenced him to 18 years for a robbery he didn't commit, based on a shaky eyewitness and a plea deal he refused to take. Samuel had always claimed innocence, but he lacked the resources, the legal firepower, and the platform to fight back. For 21 years, he carried that sentence like a scar. But after Jasmine's hearing aired, a law clinic at Ohio State reopened his case, citing inconsistencies in witness statements and forensic reports long overlooked. Within 4 months, the conviction was overturned. Samuel stood on the courthouse steps, hands trembling as he held the papers. "For the first time in my life," he said through tears, "the system finally listened. And it only took 21 years and one brave woman to make it happen." His story cracked something deeper in the public consciousness. It wasn't just about Wexler anymore. It was about everyone like Wexler, every judge who had ruled from a place of comfort while people like Samuel paid the price. Civil rights groups began compiling lists, cases that had never made the news but were linked by a pattern of rushed trials, coerced pleas, and maximum sentences handed down like reflex. Prosecutors who once feared retaliation began cooperating with an independent review board assembled by the state. What started as Jasmine's moment had turned into a judicial audit spanning decades, built on pain finally given a microphone. But the most powerful change wasn't happening in offices or press conferences. It was happening around kitchen tables, in church basements, in libraries and shelters, places where grief had long outlasted justice. Families who had once sat silently in the back rows of courtrooms now formed support groups. They met weekly, bringing folders of old paperwork, faded photographs, and folded letters from prison. They called themselves the Docket Echoes, and what began with 5 families grew to 50 within 2 months. Their goal wasn't revenge, it was healing. And at the center of every meeting was a framed photo of Jasmine in that courtroom, standing tall, letter in hand, eyes locked on power, and calling it what it was. In Cincinnati, a mother named Valerie Monroe, whose son had taken his own life after a harsh juvenile sentence from Wexler, helped organize the first statewide restorative justice gathering. She invited public defenders, former inmates, mental health professionals, and policymakers. When asked why she was doing it, she said, "Because Jasmine gave us permission to stop whispering." In her keynote speech, she held up her son's sentencing transcript and said, "He was not trash. He was not an example. He was a child. And I will spend every breath I have making sure no one else gets labeled like he was." The emotional weight of these gatherings didn't go unnoticed. Media began covering them not as side stories, but as the next chapter of the movement Jasmine had ignited. Documentary crews followed families as they reopened closed files. Local news highlighted law schools building legal clinics specifically to re-examine Wexler-era cases. Even high school students launched petitions demanding judicial transparency and access to sentencing data. Across the state, people were no longer asking if the system was broken. They were finally demanding to see who broke it and who suffered quietly while it stayed that way. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained characteristically out of the spotlight. When asked why she didn't appear at any of the press events or televised roundtables that followed, her office issued a simple statement. "She's not building a brand, she's building a bridge." But those who watched closely knew she was watching every development, every overturned case, every family reunited. In a closed-door meeting with her staff, she reportedly said, "Every time a life is reclaimed, Wexler's shadow gets smaller." Then she went back to work, reviewing policy proposals, drafting legislation that would require automatic audits on judges with abnormally high sentencing rates, and funding trauma-informed legal aid programs statewide. By month 5, the impact had become undeniable. A coalition of civil rights lawyers filed a class action suit against the state, using data compiled from hundreds of Wexler's rulings. At the same time, the state bar announced sweeping reforms to judicial oversight, including real-time public access to sentencing records, ethics complaints, and appeals data. It wasn't just reform, it was redesign. And its blueprint had started with a woman in a black suit holding a letter no one wanted to read, until she made them. In the final days of the year, as snow fell quietly on the steps of the Columbus courthouse, Samuel Ford returned, not as a plaintiff, not as a victim, but as a speaker. He stood before a crowd of nearly 300, some in suits, others in secondhand jackets and worn-out boots. "I spent more time behind bars than my kids spent in school," he said. "I used to think justice was something only other people got, but then I watched someone walk into a courtroom and say what the rest of us never could." He paused, holding up a printed quote. "You judge by your bias." He smiled. "Those 4 words? They set me free." And somewhere, listening through an old pair of earbuds, in a quiet office with no nameplate, Jasmine Crockett sat back in her chair. Not to rest, but to breathe. Because truth, once spoken, doesn't need to shout. It echoes and echoes and echoes until the walls finally break. The impact of Jasmine's voice was undeniable. Old cases reopened, communities mobilized, legislative reforms gaining ground. For the people, she had become a symbol of hope. But for the system she had dared to confront, she had become something else entirely, a threat. It started quietly, too quiet for the public to notice. A meeting canceled, a back-channel invitation never extended. Jasmine Crockett, once hailed for her clarity and courage, began to find doors she'd walked through 100 times suddenly locked, or worse, half open and watching. Inside political circles, her name stirred discomfort, not because she'd lied, but because she'd told the truth too well, too clearly, and in a room where truth was supposed to be filtered, softened, and made polite. The system hadn't expected someone from within to turn around and hold up a mirror. They expected her to play along, not tear down the stage. She was labeled, quietly at first, disruptive, unpredictable, emotional. Words that sounded neutral but cut with precision. Lobbyists who once saw her as a rising star began stepping back, whispering in closed rooms that Jasmine might not be a team player. A key donor pulled funding from a reform bill she sponsored, citing concerns about tone. Within days, a conservative PIC released an ad featuring grainy clips from the courtroom, twisted out of context with a voiceover that growled, "Does this sound like someone who respects the rule of law?" They didn't attack her with facts. They attacked her with fear, framing her as a radical, a danger, a woman too bold for her own good. In back rooms and boardrooms, the whispers got bolder. She was accused, never publicly, of being a system breaker, of undermining judicial independence by exposing its flaws too openly. One anonymous op-ed in a national legal review called her an elected official weaponizing courtroom theater for personal gain. Another, more venomous, came from a retired judge who wrote, "Justice doesn't bend to hashtags, and Crockett's grandstanding proves she cares more for applause than reform." She read that one late at night in her office while the halls were quiet, and she didn't cry, but she didn't sleep much after. The calls came next, not to her, but to her staff. Subtle warnings. You might want to steer the Congresswoman away from judicial matters for a while. There's concern she's alienating important allies. We've heard chatter. Some committees are reconsidering her leadership role. It wasn't personal, they said, just politics. But Jasmine knew better. When you challenge power, it doesn't always fight back. Sometimes it strangles you with silence. Her staff noticed it too. Invitations to roundtables stopped arriving. Legislative memos she submitted were delayed or sent back with vague notes like, "needs refinement," even when the language was airtight. In one hearing, a senior representative openly questioned her motives on the record. Are we really here to settle political grudges disguised as reform? The room shifted and Jasmine felt it, not as a blow, but a signal. The system had absorbed the damage she'd dealt. Now it was healing around her, without her. And yet, she didn't stop. She kept showing up, kept writing, kept meeting with victims and lawyers and policy experts. Because she hadn't come this far to be polite. She hadn't stood in that courtroom to play safe. She had broken the silence for people who had no microphones of their own. And if that made her a threat, then so be it. She'd learned that the system didn't fear chaos, it feared clarity. It feared a voice that wouldn't flinch when the whole machine turned to stare her down. Pressure mounted anyway. Her next bill, an initiative for real-time public access to sentencing data, was gutted in committee before it even reached the floor. A senior advisor quietly warned her, "You're burning capital faster than you're building it." She smiled at that. "Good," she said. "It means I'm not hoarding it like the rest of them." But in private, the weight grew heavier. In quiet hours, she'd sit at her desk and reread the letters from families. The ones who'd thanked her for speaking, for listening, for being the one who didn't walk past. And those letters, not the headlines, kept her steady. They reminded her what the system was supposed to protect. Not status, not tradition. People. Then came the moment she knew would come. A private meeting request from a high-ranking party figure. Someone who'd once endorsed her early campaign. The meeting took place in a quiet office. No press, no staff. Just 2 chairs and a long table between them. "Jasmine," the official said, "you're too smart to get yourself iced out of influence. You've got a future, but not if you keep making enemies out of institutions." She met the gaze without blinking. Institutions that fail don't deserve loyalty. They deserve reform. The man sighed, leaned back. "That's not how it works." Jasmine stood. "Then I'll change how it works." She left that meeting knowing the cost of clarity, but she'd made peace with that price long ago. Back outside, the wind cut sharp across the Capitol steps. Reporters were already asking questions. The media narrative was starting to shift. Some began to call her divisive. Others asked if she was too aggressive. But none of them were asking why she had to be. None were asking what kind of world forced a woman like Jasmine Crockett to burn through the system just to be heard. So she answered in the only way she knew how, with another draft bill, with another town hall, with another courtroom visit, this time as a guest speaker for law students studying judicial ethics. And when one student raised their hand and asked if she feared political consequences, Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Fear," she said. "Fear is what happens when you've been told the system is your only hope, and then it turns on you. What I fear is silence. What I fear is looking away." And as she walked off the stage, she knew something they didn't. They could take her committee seats. They could block her legislation. They could cut her off from funding and label her radical. But they could never take back what she had already made them hear. They tried to isolate her, to paint her as too loud, too bold, too willing to say what others were too comfortable to face. But Jasmine didn't come to play the part of a hero. She came to rewrite the rules, and 1 year later, the system was forced to read them out loud. It didn't happen in a blaze of glory. It happened the way real revolutions do. Slowly, steadily, with pushback and bruises, with setbacks and scraped knuckles. But exactly 12 months after Jasmine Crockett stood in that courtroom and exposed the rot behind the robe, Congress passed the Community Justice Act. The vote was closer than it should have been, and the speeches leading up to it were filled with the usual cautionary warnings. We must protect the independence of our judiciary. Let's not demonize our legal institutions, and so on. But none of it mattered when the final gavel dropped, because for the first time in decades, power had listened to pain and responded. 3 major pillars defined the act. The first sent shockwaves through courthouses across the country. All criminal court proceedings would now be recorded, audio and video, and made publicly accessible. No more whispered rulings. No more behind-the-door deals that never made it into transcripts. Every bail decision, every motion denied, every word uttered by a judge, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, captured, archived, and exposed to the eyes and ears of the people the system claimed to serve. The courtroom, once a chamber of selective memory, was now a space of total accountability. Judges who had once ruled with unchecked discretion would now be judged by the public as well. It was transparency, not as a principle, but as a weapon, sharpened by the very people who had once been silenced inside those same 4 walls. The second provision shook the legal establishment even harder. Term limits for state judges. No longer could a single person sit on a bench for decades, wielding life-altering power with no end in sight. Under the new law, a judge would serve a maximum of 12 years before mandatory rotation. They would be subject to midterm evaluations by independent panels, and their rulings would be assessed for consistency, equity, and bias. The judicial lifetime appointment, a fixture of untouchable power, was shattered. Wexler's legacy, and those like him, had proven the cost of permanence. Now the system would be forced to breathe, to change, to remember that no seat should ever be eternal, not when people's futures were at stake. But it was the third reform that came directly from the fire Jasmine had carried into that courtroom. The formation of community oversight councils. These weren't symbolic watchdogs or rubber stamp panels. They were real, binding, and built from the ground up. Every county with a population over 50,000 was required to establish a local council made up of public defenders, social workers, legal scholars, and most importantly, citizens who had been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. People like Samuel Ford, people like Valerie Monroe, people who knew what injustice looked like not from textbooks, but from prison visiting rooms and courtroom benches. The councils were given subpoena power, full access to judicial records, and a direct line to state ethics boards. Their job was not to supervise, it was to intervene when power strayed. Critics called it overreach, they called it radical. But those words lost their sharpness when confronted with numbers, like the 38% of Wexler's rulings overturned on appeal, or the thousands of black and brown defendants sentenced to the maximum with no prior offenses. The numbers didn't lie, and the people didn't forget. Jasmine never claimed the act would fix everything, but it was a beginning, a reset button slammed down with conviction. As the bill passed, the House chamber was silent for a beat too long, like even the air wasn't sure what had just happened. Then one by one, lawmakers began to rise. Some clapped, some didn't, but everyone knew the ground had shifted. Reporters flooded out of the chamber, chasing quotes and reactions. But Jasmine slipped out through a side hallway, her steps echoing in the marble silence. She didn't need to be seen. The law spoke for her now. In the following weeks, headlines shifted again. The Crockett Clause changes the game. Transparency is now the standard. Community watchdog groups already flagging sentencing trends. But while the media praised the reforms, others moved in the shadows. Some judges retired early. Others challenged the law in court, citing judicial overreach and threats to autonomy. But the people had tasted access. And once the public sees the machinery behind the curtain, it's impossible to convince them the gears are clean. Meanwhile, Jasmine kept her distance from celebration, while cable panels debated the scope of her influence and political commentators argued whether she would run for higher office. She returned to the neighborhoods that had first pushed her into public life. She met with re-entry coordinators and court watchdogs, offered legal clinics in schools and churches, and sat in town halls listening more than speaking. Because she understood something the system had forgotten. Laws are only as strong as the people willing to enforce them with humanity. One afternoon, as she stood outside a juvenile justice center in Akron, a teenager approached her, holding a copy of the new law printed out from a library computer. "They have to record my hearing now," he said, eyes wide, voice small. "My mom can watch. They can't lie anymore." Jasmine smiled, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "They never should have in the first place." In D.C., the tremors continued. States began drafting their own versions of the Community Justice Act. Civil rights groups lobbied for a federal extension. Law schools rewrote sections of their ethics curriculum. For the first time, courtroom transparency was no longer a reformer's dream. It was law, and all of it could be traced back to one moment, one hearing, one voice that chose not to be polite when the truth was burning for air. Jasmine never put her name on the law. She never branded it, never capitalized on it. But those who read the final bill noticed something subtle on the last page. An italicized quote buried in the legislative notes, not part of the legal text, but preserved in the record nonetheless. The truth doesn't need a robe or a microphone, just someone brave enough to say it at the right time. And now that truth had become policy, not because the system had invited it, but because someone broke through the silence and made it listen. The Community Justice Act had become law. The tide had turned. But with victory came attention, calls from donors, invitations from party leaders, and pressure from strategists who saw in Jasmine Crockett not just a reformer, but a potential candidate for higher office. They expected her to climb. Instead, she chose to dig. She received the invitation over lunch. A sealed envelope slipped quietly onto her desk by a staffer, too eager to mask their excitement. It was from the National Leadership Committee, a formal nod that they were watching her, that they were interested, that if she played the game just right, the next step could be a Senate seat, maybe even a ticket to something bigger. She read it once, then again. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper, but her expression didn't change. Later that afternoon, at a press conference where reporters leaned forward waiting for her announcement, she smiled only faintly and said, "I'm honored." Truly, but no. A silence rippled through the room. Then she added, clear, unwavering, "I don't need to climb higher. I need to dig deeper." The words echoed far beyond the microphones. Cable hosts spun it as political posturing, but the people who knew her understood what it meant. She wasn't looking for a bigger stage. She was building something at the foundation. While others chased titles, Jasmine was still meeting with families, sitting in courtrooms, and funding legal aid clinics out of her own past. She hadn't come to rise. She'd come to root out the rot. Meanwhile, in a bright lecture hall at Columbia Law School, 22 students gathered around long tables stacked with transcripts and highlighters. The course was Contemporary Judicial Ethics, and the day's assignment was no ordinary case law. Projected on the screen was a still image from the hearing that had started it all. Jasmine Crockett standing before Judge Roland Wexler, letter in hand, her voice frozen mid-sentence. The professor leaned forward. "This," she said, "is where law and moral courage intersect." They read her words aloud, line by line. They paused at the quote about bias, at her refusal to flinch under pressure, at the moment she stood when the room expected her to shrink. "She didn't just argue," one student said. "She exposed." Another nodded. "She didn't win by shouting louder. She won because she made silence impossible." Outside that room, the city buzzed as always, but inside something quiet and permanent had taken hold. Her story wasn't just being remembered, it was being taught, not as spectacle, but as precedent. Not in casebooks, but in classrooms where future lawyers were learning that courage wasn't in the volume of your voice, but in the steadiness of your stance. And far from the echo of those halls, in a small living room in Toledo, a different kind of moment unfolded. The lights were dim, a late dinner barely touched. The TV muted on a local news segment about criminal justice reform. On the couch sat a man in his 50s, hands calloused from warehouse work, eyes worn from years of waiting. He had been one of Wexler's forgotten, sentenced harshly, wrongfully, and recently exonerated after 2 decades. Next to him sat his daughter, maybe 9 years old, legs swinging, eyes curious. "Daddy," she asked, tugging at his sleeve, "what is justice?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at the TV, though it said nothing. Then he looked at her, slowly, carefully, with the weight of every courtroom he'd stood in and every breath he'd held. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. His voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer strength it took to speak clearly after so many years of silence. "Justice," he said, "is when someone stands up, even when the whole room stays quiet." And in that answer, there was everything. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.